And over the past year and a half, I've been researching this subject, and I have a co-authored article about it forthcoming in the journal Era Ireland next year. As many here will know, of course, there hasn't been all that much scholarly research on Catholic fundraising in Ireland post-independence. And this research then breaks some new ground in that way. But in framing my arguments, I've been greatly influenced by the work of historians who have studied earlier time periods, and in particular Sarah Roddy, part of this panel, her collaborator Patrick Doyle, and I think also the generation of scholars who followed Emmett Larkin's lead in the 1970s and 1980s. I'm also extremely grateful to the Catholic Diocese of Cork and Ross for making available to me their exceptionally rich archives as part of this work. Lucy built 10 new churches in his first decade as bishop. This pace of building was as fast as any time in Cork's history. To raise such vast funds required, he set up weekly collections in each parish. He published lists of donations in his new diocesan magazine, The Fold, and he also sought donations from companies and from the city's elite. He even set up a used paper recycling scheme where children were encouraged to collect paper and cardboard in towns and villages across the county for shipment to the large paper mills in Waterford, raising thousands of pounds for the new churches in Cork. Yet I think arguably the most remarkable element of this fundraising drive was the Tabernacle Fund here in the middle on the right, which I want to focus on in this brief paper. The Tabernacle Fund was run by Mrs. Frances Wren from her home in the southwest of Cork City. Donations to it were printed in The Fold from November 1953 until well into the 1970s, though as part of this research I stopped when Mrs. Wren died in 1966. The Tabernacle Fund was overwhelmingly the preserve of Cork's women, and while it included some monetary gifts, it comprised mostly gifts of wedding rings, jewellery, and precious stones and metals. Wren arranged for the valuable metals to be melted down and reused, and to have the jewels inserted into the tabernacles of the new churches. Over the space of 14 years, there were almost 2,000 donations printed in The Fold. These provide a rich source for analysing, in particular, female agency and devotional culture in mid-century Ireland. Frances Wren, born Frances Cunningham, was an influential member of Cork's Catholic elite. Her stewardship of the Tabernacle Fund brought conservative religiosity and social respectability to the practicalities of collecting jewellery and precious metals for the tabernacles of these new churches. She was a domestic economy teacher by training, fluent in the Irish language, and she was married to the Cork County Manager, Joseph Wren. Frances Wren served alongside Bishop Lucy in the 1940s and 50s as a member of the Irish government's Commission on Emigration. She toured agricultural shows throughout Munster as a judge for cooking and baking competitions, and she published some books. I think probably the best-selling of those was The Complete Book of Vegetables and Fruit, 1943, republished 1946, which found a home in many an Irish kitchen. Wren wrote the Women at Home section of The Fold from its founding issue. In it, she mixed together traditional Catholic family values with recipes for soups, breads, and cakes, and other topics that she considered of interest to Catholic housewives. Her only son was ordained a priest, and he died in 2006. He spent most of his career working in the Cork and Ross diocese, and he served also as the intermediary for many of the donations that were given to his mother. Now, as highly decorated vessels for the reservation of the consecrated Eucharist, tabernacles were quite literally the jewels in the crown of Cork's new churches, to be admired by the Catholic faithful and to be the focal point of the building located directly behind the main altar. Souvenir pamphlets of the new churches often featured close-up photographs of these new tabernacles with their lock and key, their gilding, and their inlay of precious metals and diamonds. For example, at the opening of St. Francis Church in Cork City in 1953, this was actually not one of Lucy's churches, but it was obviously it was the Franciscans' new church in the city. The Cork Examiner noted that, quote, "The crowning feature of the whole scene is the gorgeous tabernacle. Its interior is of solid gold and jewels, composed of the free gifts of thousands of the faithful." The Cork Evening Echo suggested that, quote, "It is probable that every family in the city has played its part, and that is as it should be." The art of designing and building tabernacles was a highly specialized and time-consuming activity. Each one cost on average £450, or in those years, about the same cost as buying a new motor car. For the Cork city churches, Wren began her appeal by asking for, quote, gifts of gold, jewellery, precious stones and money for a new church at Grona in the north of the city, which was the first of Lucy's new churches. These gifts she promised would, quote, recall in the years to come your pledge of love and loyalty to Jesus and to your parish, promising to acknowledge all gifts personally and that initially no lists would be published. She then changed tack on this as parishioners began posting gifts to her, and her appeal was broadened out to include all of the new churches. From 1953 until her death, the monthly Women at Home section included these lists of largely anonymous donations, sometimes taking up an entire page of the fold. In general, when money was given, it tended to be very, very small amounts. For example, one donor who went anonymously as for Marian Year gave just 2 shillings and sixpence. And in 83% of cases where the gender can be identified, that donor was a woman. Donations often included a dedication, the most common being in memory of a deceased family member. Cash donations, though, were, however, a fairly small part of the overall fundraising effort, and yet they still raised almost £3,000 overall. The median here was just £2, the mode was just £1. The majority of these gifts reached Wren's office, by which I mean actually Wren's home, anonymously, either via intermediaries, largely priests, or in envelopes, for example, that were marked anonymous by post or registered post Copine being a village here in West Cork. The extraordinary success of the Tabernacle Fund reinforced Wren's confidence in the faith and the goodwill of Cork's Catholics, and especially of its women. I think a key thing here to note is that while the weekly parish collections certainly had there was a sense whereby one was obliged to contribute, because if one didn't, it would be fairly obvious. In this case, this is a purely extra optional form of a largely anonymous donation, which is going on in these years, and so it's harder to find, for example, social pressure behind the donations of these women. The appeal was, in Wren's words, a call to homemakers to build a tabernacle home for the hidden Jesus in our midst. She was moved by the personal nature of so many of the gifts, writing that, quote, long cherished keepsakes of saintly mothers will now find a resting place in the new churches. Offerings, she noted, were pouring in from, quote, the little homes of the diocese. As the tabernacles were unveiled, she featured photographs of them in the fold, proudly announcing that the entire cost had been defrayed by readers of this page. None of the new tabernacles meant more to her than the tabernacle in what became her new parish church at Dennehy's Cross in the southwest of the city. It included no fewer than 200 jewelled engagement rings and 300 golden wedding rings, and the entire cost of it was paid for by the women of the local Child of Mary sodality. My gaze, Wren wrote, rested on the gold and the jewelled tabernacle, and I recalled the very many wedding rings which had been melted down to line the interior of it, and of the many diamonds surrendered to decorate it within and without. On the eve of this church's opening, she added, a little lady had come to her with a donation of a linen covering for the altar, which was used on the consecration day. Her contributions to the fold include several such descriptions of how women chose to give gifts anonymously and without attracting notoriety. For example, later in 1961, she said, there came to me on a June Sunday a small paper bag marked on the outside Anon. I tore off the cellophane tape which fastened it, and out spilled shining golden coins, 31 sovereigns and 26 half sovereigns, to be used for the new tabernacle at Mayfield, also in the city. Here in the photograph you can see literally the wedding rings, engagement rings and so on inserted into the tabernacle of the new church in Dennehy's Cross, still there today. The character of these gifts and the pseudonyms and the dedications attached to them, I think, speak to the everyday devotion of Cork's Catholic women in these years. The decision to give such personal and intimate items of jewellery for melting down in many cases, or for incorporation, was clearly not made lightly. These donations included at least 1,087 gold rings, 21 diamond rings, many of which were noted as wedding or engagement rings of, for example, deceased parents or partners, items which Eilis Debarra in these years refers to as the most prized possession of Cork women in the mid-century time. Jewellery makes up the bulk of the gifts that were received: 628 watches, 200 chains, 133 brooches, 67 bracelets, 45 pairs of earrings, 24 pairs of cufflinks, and 3 pearl necklaces. Other typical donations included over 400 sovereign or half-sovereign coins and 274 gold or silver medals, many of which, for example, had been awarded in sporting or in musical competitions, for example, the GA or the Feis Ceoil. More unusual were medals from military service, including one, for example, labelled American Military Medal. Donations also gave a wide range of other personal and household items. Other things turned up, essentially what I mean, beyond rings and so on, including teapots, sugar bowls, cigarette cases, crucifixes, bells, candlesticks, chalices, precious stones, inkwells, spectacle cases, vases and jugs, pencils, table stands, knives, and decanters. Donors even used the Tabernacle Fund as an opportunity to give items for children making their first Holy Communion. As noted, a majority of these were given anonymously, though donors typically included a pseudonym or a dedication. Here, an attempt to try and put together some of those many dedications and anonymous pseudonyms that were used by donors. Beyond cases of in memory of or the inclusion of a person's initials, many of these gave indicators of gender and class. For example, a grateful widow, a lock woman, a poor donor, factory employees, nurse, working girls, and a widow's mite. Some focused on personal devotion, for example, from an admirer of the servant of God, Matt Talbot, while others simply gave context. Contents of purse found, half of money received from England. Many spoke to personal struggles: unworthy, a sinner, for an abandoned soul, believer in prayer, one in poor health. And 2 donations in particular marked poignantly tragedy and loss, simply saying, in memory of little Catherine. The Tabernacle Fund developed a momentum that sustained it long beyond the other parts of Lucy's fundraising drive in these years. By 1963, all of the new churches in Cork City had been provided with these new tabernacles. Wren at this point considered winding up the appeal, but donations essentially kept pouring in. And when a new tabernacle was proposed for the rural parish of Ballinadee near Bandon in the mid-60s, dozens of more gifts came in, mostly again from the women of that area. This was quickly followed by an appeal for a new tabernacle for Lucy's missionary church in the El Porvenir district of Trillo in Peru, and then later for 2 more Peruvian churches. Overall, the bulk of the donations for Lucy's new churches came from the weekly parish donations and from the local businesses and from the wealthy in the area. But the Tabernacle Fund, I think, represents perhaps the most interesting legacy of these years, socially and culturally, in terms of what it reveals about female agency and Catholic material culture in years which are typically associated with social conservatism and also economic scarcity. So I'll stop there. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Richard. And thank you to all of the speakers, Niamh, Caroline, Sarah as well. All of them were really tight on time and excellently done. So thank you very much for that. I'm going to stop the recording.